Let's talk about how cameras work. Basically, all cameras are a box with a sensor and a lens. And creating a photo, capturing a photo, means you're exposing that sensor to light. Now, there are three variables to exposure, to capturing a photo. There's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And when you talk about the three together, it's referred to as the exposure triangle. So let's start with aperture. Aperture is basically how much light gets through a lens. A lens is able to open and close, so a larger aperture or smaller aperture, to let in more light or limit the amount of light coming through. A large aperture lets a lot of light through. It creates a brighter image. Large apertures are represented by lower f numbers, like f1.4 or f2. Smaller apertures limit the amount of light that gets through. They create a darker image, and they're going to be represented by higher f numbers, like f16 or f22. In addition to controlling how much light gets through, aperture also controls depth of field, or how much of the image, how much of the scene is in focus. People will think about this as the blurry background effect a lot of the time, where a shallow depth of field would mean that only your subject in the foreground is in focus and the background is completely blown out and out of focus. It's really blurry. Great for separation, great for portraits. A deep depth of field means everything, or at least a lot more of the scene, is in focus. So like think about a landscape. You usually have the entire scene in focus. Large apertures, low f numbers, create a shallower depth of field. Small apertures, high f numbers, create a deeper depth of field. Now behind that lens and in front of the sensor, there's usually a shutter. The shutter opens and closes and controls how long that light passes through. Slower shutter speeds, or a shutter opening longer, are going to let more light through. Faster shutter speeds are going to limit the amount of light getting through. Now typically shutter speeds are between a 15th of a second and a 1,000th of a second. Could be more, could be less, but they're usually a quick fraction of a second. Something to keep in mind is longer shutters or slower shutter speeds. They're also going to be more prone to motion blur or camera shake, whereas faster shutters are going to not only limit the light, but freeze the action. So if you're taking a photo of sports, you probably want a shutter speed of a 500th of a second, a 1,000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second. Whereas if you're taking photos of stars at night, you're probably going to need a longer shutter to let in more light, but that also means that you don't want your subject moving, and you might want the camera on a tripod so that there's not motion blur and camera shake. The third and final piece of the puzzle is ISO. ISO is basically how sensitive the sensor is to light. Now cameras will list a range of ISOs, maybe ISO 100 to ISO 30,000. Usually the upper end of that range is kind of BS. I mean, it's well past what's actually usable, but still the range a camera lists is a good indication as to how sensitive that camera's sensor is. Some sensors are much more sensitive to light. They gather a whole lot of light. They can almost see in the dark. Those will usually be larger sensors. Some sensors are less sensitive to light. They need a whole lot of light to create a good image, usually smaller sensors. Think about light like signal, and think about increasing that ISO number like amplification. If a sensor needs a lot of light but doesn't get a ton of light, it's getting a weak signal. To make that signal usable, we need to amplify it. If you amplify a weak signal too much, you're going to get distortion. And in photography, that's noise or grain, artifacts. So as you increase that ISO number from 800 to 1600 to 3200 to 6400, as you get up there, you're going to increase the amount of noise or the amount of grain in the photo. So as you can see, those three variables control not only the exposure, how bright or how dark the image is, how much light gets exposed to the sensor, but they're also controlling motion blur, controlling your depth of field, controlling the amount of noise in the photo. And fortunately, most cameras have automated modes that kind of take care of all of that for you, making sure you get a pretty decent photo. Most cameras will also have fully manual modes, allowing the photographer to manually adjust each one of those parameters to get the exact effect that they want. Most cameras will also have some shooting modes in between the two, which is probably where most enthusiast level photographers spend their time. Usually called like aperture priority or shutter priority. That'll mean You set one of those variables, and the camera's computer figures out the other variables for you, compensates for you. So you can select the aperture, so you can control that depth of field, and the camera will do the math on the other stuff to make sure it's exposed properly. Let's jump over to camera sensors for a second, dive a little bit deeper. The biggest factor, in my opinion, when you're comparing one camera body to another is sensor size. Basically, large sensors are better. Large sensors gather more light, they have better dynamic range, and they can create a shallower depth of field. In addition to aperture controlling depth of field, larger sensors are more capable of a shallow depth of field. Large sensors are usually going to be found in DSLRs, in mirrorless cameras, especially high-end mirrorless cameras. At the top, you'll see full-frame sensors, which is the same size as a piece of 35mm film, and then slightly smaller APS-C sensors. That's what you're going to find in your DSLRs and your higher-end mirrorless. Next step down from that is going to be micro 4/3 and then 1-inch sensors. 4/3 is 4/3 of an inch, or an inch and a third. Still pretty large, still good sensors, still good dynamic range. That's usually going to be mirrorless cameras, higher-end point-and-shoot cameras. Smaller than that are sensors that are 1/3 of an inch, 1/2 of an inch, probably what you're going to find in less expensive point-and-shoots, in cell phones, and action cameras. They are going to have very limited dynamic range. They're going to need a lot of light. They'll be almost useless at nighttime, and they won't be capable of creating a very shallow depth of field. The other big factor with sensors is resolution, megapixels. We see that spec all the time. Frankly, it's not a very important spec. In the early days of digital photography, 1 megapixel versus 2 megapixels, it was a big deal. Nowadays, if you're comparing a 21 megapixel camera to a 24 megapixel camera, really they're both more than enough. 4K is about 8 megapixels as a reference point. So most cameras have way more than enough resolution for most people. Let's jump over to lenses for a second. Lenses really have two distinguishing factors when you're comparing them. One is maximum aperture. We've already talked about that. A larger maximum aperture lets you shoot in lower light situations, and it allows you to create a shallower depth of field. The other big factor is focal length. Focal length is basically perspective, how wide or tight the field of view is. Usually we think of 50 millimeters as a normal focal length. That's about how our eyes see things. Whereas a number lower than 50 millimeters is a wide focal length, a wide angle. On the other hand, numbers higher than 50 millimeters are going to be telephoto lenses. The higher the number, 200, 400, the tighter that perspective is going to be, almost like being more zoomed in. Telephoto lenses are good for things like portraits, for wildlife, for sporting events where you're up in the stands and all the action is really far away. They allow you to kind of reach further. Wide-angle lenses are going to be used for landscapes, architecture, action sports, POV style stuff like a GoPro. Now the last thing I want to talk about is a tricky subject, so we'll try to keep it simple, and that's crop factor. Crop factor is basically how different size sensors affect the way a lens looks, affect the way a focal length looks. So basically, smaller sensors only see a portion of what a larger sensor would see. Think about a quarter and a dime. If you stick a dime on top of a quarter, it's only going to cover the center portion of that quarter. Same thing happens if you stick a 1-inch sensor in front of a full-frame sensor. It's only seeing the center portion. It's cropping the image. What that means is if you have like a 50 millimeter lens, it looks one way with a full-frame sensor, but it looks a lot tighter with a smaller sensor. Every different sensor size is going to have a different magnification, a different crop factor. Good news is you don't have to memorize that. You don't have to do the math or the conversion. We'll do it for you. I mean, go through our website, go through ProdInfo, and we will list full frame equivalents. That basically takes care of all of that math, all of that conversion. So all you need to look at is the full frame equivalent field of view, also sometimes called 35 millimeter equivalent field of view. And that'll let you know, okay, this looks like a 50 millimeter, so it looks normal. This looks like a wide angle, like a 28 millimeter. This looks like a 200 millimeter. That's your reference point. That's how you'll know, okay, this customer wants to take photos of landscapes. I know he needs a wide angle. So I know to look for something that is has a full frame equivalent of a wide angle, like 35 millimeters or 21 millimeters or 18 millimeters. That's your reference point. So hopefully this helps a little bit. I mean, as you can see, there are lots of different variables in exposing the photo and controlling the different properties of a photo and controlling the perspective that the camera sees, that the lens sees. But hopefully this kind of covers the basics. If you have questions, that's fine. We'll go over some of this in more detail. And we'll also start getting into qualifying customers and examples of the right gear for the right shooter or for the right situation. So thank you for watching and hope that helps.